It is the 1520s, and you are standing in a small paneled room in a royal palace, holding a folded linen cloth and a basin of warm water. On the other side of that door is the most powerful man in England. In a moment you will go in, and you will help him use the toilet, and afterwards you will clean him. That is not a joke, and it is not a punishment. It is your job. It is written down in the household accounts with a formal title attached, and there are men at this court who would ruin you tomorrow to take it. Because this job, the single most humiliating job in the building, was one of the most powerful positions in the kingdom. The title was Groom of the Stool. The stool in question was not a seat. It was the close stool, the royal toilet, and it is worth understanding what that object actually was, because it tells you a great deal about the job. A close stool was a piece of furniture, a padded box with a hinged lid, a pewter basin sitting inside it, and for a king it was upholstered like a throne. Henry VIII's was covered in black velvet, studded with gilt nails, and finished with ribbons. It was not fixed to any room. It travelled with the court, and so did the man responsible for it. His duties, set out plainly, were to carry that stool, to supply the water, the cloth, and the basin, to be present while the king used it, and to clean the king afterwards. And over time, quietly, the job grew. He took charge of the king's private rooms, then the king's clothing and his linen. Then, in some reigns, the king's private money. Which brings us to the obvious question. If the work was that degrading, why was it worth fighting over? Here is the answer, and it is the whole point of this story. In a personal monarchy, there is no meaningful line between the king's body and the state. There is no separate government office you can go and petition. There is no cabinet, no civil service, no diary secretary. Decisions happen where the king happens to be, in the moment he happens to be in, and they are made by a man who is tired or angry or unwell or in a good mood because the hunting went well. If you want something from England, you do not need a department. You need a few minutes alone with a specific human being. The groom of the stool had those minutes every single day, and nobody else did. Think about what he actually saw. He saw the king undressed. He saw him ill. He was there first thing in the morning, before the king had put on the performance of being a king, and last thing at night when it came off. He knew who had visited, what the king had said about them afterwards, and what mood he would be in before a meeting that half the court was terrified about. In a system where timing was everything, that knowledge was worth more than land. And because the king could not exactly stand on ceremony with the man holding the basin, the relationship became something a monarch almost never had. Ordinary company. The groom of the stool was, in practice, a friend, and one of the very few people who could say something to the king without asking permission first. So the job made men. Sir William Compton held it under the young Henry VIII and became enormously rich, collecting offices, land and fees, while everyone knew perfectly well how he had got close enough to ask. Sir Henry Norris held it next, and he shows you the other edge of the same knife. Norris was head of the Privy Chamber, one of the king's closest companions, and the man who controlled who reached him. Then, in 1536, Anne Boleyn fell, and the men around her fell with her. Norris was arrested and accused of adultery with the Queen. He was, by several accounts, offered his life if he would confess. He refused, said the Queen was innocent, and was beheaded. He had been close enough to the king to become powerful, and that is exactly the distance at which you are dangerous. Then there is Sir Anthony Denny, who held the post at the end of Henry's life, and whose story is the strangest of the three. By that point, the king was too ill to sign documents reliably, so a wooden stamp of his signature was used, pressed into the paper, and then inked in afterwards. Denny controlled that stamp. Read that again. The man whose original job description involved cleaning the king now decided which documents left the room carrying the royal signature. And when the end came, it was Denny who had to walk in and tell Henry VIII, a man who had made it treason to predict the king's death, that he was dying and should prepare himself. Now the job did not stay that way forever, and how it changed is quietly revealing. As government grew into something that could function without the monarch personally deciding everything, the post drifted. It turned into an honor handed to earls, The actual unpleasant work moved down to lesser servants, and the title became ceremonial. And somewhere along the way, the spelling shifted. Stool became stole, which is a garment, and the office survived under that tidier name until 1901, when Edward VII finally abolished it. Whether that respelling was an accident or a piece of deliberate housekeeping is argued about. The effect was the same either way. The name stopped announcing what the job had been. It is worth adding that the logic did not depend on the job being male or on the toilet. When a woman ruled, the same principle simply moved. The women who dressed Elizabeth I and slept in her chamber held the identical currency, which was private access, and courtiers wrote to them for exactly the same reason. So what is the actual lesson buried under all the velvet and the basins? That in any system where power runs through a person rather than a process, influence does not follow the job title, it follows proximity. The org chart tells you who is important. It does not tell you who is in the room at 11 at night when the decision actually gets made, and those are very often not the same people. That has not gone away. It moved. The modern version is not carrying a velvet box. It is the private secretary who controls the diary, the chief of staff who decides which problem gets raised and which one waits until Monday, the assistant everybody is polite to for reasons they would struggle to write down. None of them appear high on any organization chart. All of them shape what the person at the top ever gets to consider, which is the genuinely useful thing hiding inside a job that sounds like a punchline. The Tudors were not confused about status. They understood something we tend to forget, which is that access is not a perk of power. It is the thing itself. The most humiliating job in the palace made men into lords because it was the only job in England that came with a locked door and a king on the other side of it. If you want more history that turns out cleverer than it looks, subscribe.